I'd like to welcome everybody to, and those of you online, to one of our great visiting speakers at the Summer Institute here. It's our pleasure today to have Winter Mason from Facebook. Winter is like one of the people we thought of first when we were thinking about who to invite, in part because his kind of vita reads like the history of the field. So, he's done seminal work on using Turk for behavioral experiments. He's done work on social influence. I was telling him earlier, I wish he was here earlier for Josh and Abdullah's talks on collective wisdom, because he's done some of the foundational papers of that in many of the best journals, around, PNAS. We've also had a variety of conversations around where people publish, and Winter's CV really reads like, covering just like every type of awesome publication, from, the very best conference proceedings to the very best general interest venues. And I think today we're going to hear about some of the classic work, and maybe a little bit about some new stuff. But before he gets started, well, first of all, join me in welcoming him. I've explained to him that our convention here is to, interrupt and engage, but he would also probably very much appreciate knowing kind of briefly who everyone is. And so if we could just all go around again and just say your name and discipline, that would be great. Maddie, would you get started?
Martin Markup, political science / computer science.
Lisa Argyle, political science.
Rochelle Sherman, political science.
Ian Gray, sociology.
Taylor Brown, sociology. Yo-Yo Chen, demography.
Charlotte Lloyd, sociology.
Elliot Ash, economics. Jeff Jacobs, political science.
Abdul Al-Maku, computer science.
Joshua Becker, communication.
Maria Rodriguez, social work.
Hi, I'm Pete. I'm in computational social science.
Kat Albrecht, sociology. Anna Filipova, computer science.
Antje Kirchner, survey methods.
Mike Yeomans, I'm in behavioral science.
Connor Gilroy, sociology.
Iseo, demography.
Moritz Mucci, communication.
Yoka Shirado in sociology.
Molly, psychology.
Ethan, political science.
Anjali, organizational behavior.
Ali, computer science.
Kevin, sociology.
Adani, sociology as well.
Rithi, demography.
Hi.
Well, pleasure. Nice to meet you all. I'm not going to remember all of your names, so please reintroduce yourself often. And don't be offended when I ask 3 times. I was looking at kind of what the Summer Institute was about, going over kind of what you guys have been learning over the past week or so, and I realized that I could basically give you additional examples of all of these different kinds of methods that you've been learning about in computational science by just walking through some of my old school research. And so, these are the methods that I want to talk about today. The very first one is not actually computational social science, but it is something that I first did at Facebook. And so it is my opportunity to talk about a little bit about the kinds of things that I'm doing at present. And then the rest, we'll just go through. So the first thing, my background is in social psychology and cognitive science. That's what my PhD is in. But right after I got out of that, out of grad school, I went to a postdoc at Yahoo, where I basically got a second education in computer science. And that's how I ended up in this like new field of computational social science, was because I was taking my research knowledge that I had and domain expertise that I had from grad school and bringing it into Yahoo and kind of big data world. But even when I was in grad school and learning social psychology, I never really had a lot of respect for qualitative research. I'm just being honest here. I'm like admitting my prejudices, And it wasn't until until I got to Facebook and I started working with the Civic Engagement team that I learned the value and why it's so important. And so, I want to just briefly talk about the kinds of qualitative research that I've done and sort of how it's done and why it's important in one slide. So all that I mean when I say qualitative research is just asking people things. Okay, so in computational social science and with my background, all of my kind of experience in gathering data boiled down to running experiments in the lab, delivering surveys to people online or offline, mining behavioral traces in digital data to understand people's behavior. And all of this is actually excellent, and I highly encourage it. And there's lots of good stuff that I'll be talking about using those kinds of methodologies, but there is something that about qualitative research, which is it's expensive. It's incredibly time consuming. It's not at all generalizable. It's completely fraught with all kinds of pitfalls that can make the data garbage, but it's also incredibly valuable. Okay, and why is it incredibly valuable? Because the what and how to your questions you can find in the data, but you really need to ask people to understand why. Right? You need to actually talk to them to get their sense of what is the reason that you are doing this. And those kinds of questions can inform your interpretation of the data that you have just mined, right? The Twitter data that you've just collected, the experimental results that you have. Asking people, what was going on here when you were like, your mouse was constantly in the top right corner of your screen? What were you doing, right? And understanding that can actually give you a lot of insight that can guide future research or can help guide the analysis of the data that you've already collected. Actually, before I go there, the kinds of things that I've been doing recently, the qualitative research that I've been doing recently, is in the civic engagement world. So I've been working with the civic engagement team at Facebook, and we've been trying to do a lot to understand how are people using Facebook to engage with their government representatives. What are they, what can we do to sort of give people more of a voice in their government? And so in order to understand this, I've gotten to talk to a bunch of different people around the United States about what they think about talking to the representatives. When would you ever want to talk to your representative? What do you think is effective in terms of talking to your representative? We've also gotten to talk to congressional staffers and ask them, like, what do you care about? What do you want to hear from your constituents? What kinds of things impact the policy decision making most that you hear from your constituents, and what can we do ultimately? The point of all of these questions is to figure out what Facebook can do to try to make that process better. And so in doing this, one of the things that I learned very quickly was that you need to have a script. And you need to have a script because, A, you want to make sure that the questions you're asking aren't things that you could just get from the data. You don't want to sit down and ask somebody, how many politicians do you follow, right? Like, you can just find that in the data, right? Instead, you want to ask, why do you follow politicians? Why don't you follow politicians? Because that's not something you can easily get from the data. And so you develop the script so that you know what you're going to ask, and so that you're asking a consistent set of questions to everybody that you interview. But the important part is that it's a script, and so that you have all of these things. It's also helpful so that you don't, for instance, ask leading questions in which you end up getting the answer that you're looking for because you've crafted the question in such a way. But it's also important to deviate from the script. So the number of times where you have this line of questioning, and at the end of you're planning on asking about this other topic, but the person just starts talking about that topic. They're like, "Oh, fake news on Facebook," and you're like, "Okay, let's talk about that." Whenever you do the qualitative research, there's two people. You have the interviewer and the note taker. And the reason why you do this is because the interviewer has to be focused on asking the right questions, making sure that they're asking the questions correctly and appropriately, making sure that they're getting the full response from the participants and that they're fully engaged. And then the note taker is there so that you have somebody that has a kind of bigger picture and can give you the data that you're ultimately going to use on the end. And yes, it is data, even if it is qualitative. And because then in the end, what you do is you take, let's say you've interviewed 20 people, you've asked the same question to 20 different people, and hopefully if you've done your sampling right, it's 20 very different people. And then you can say, well, what are the common themes that come out when we've asked the same question to 20 different people? And one of the things that's most remarkable about qualitative research is that you actually see common responses to these why questions. Why are you following a petition? Why are you not following a politician? Why didn't you vote this election, right? I mean, inevitably, for instance, and this is like classic political science literature, so you political scientists are very familiar with this, but, you know, people have a feeling of lack of efficacy, and either it's, I could say whatever I want to the politician, it's never going to change their opinion, right? Or I just don't feel like I know enough about politics to say anything worth saying. And those two opinions are kind of the number one blockers, or number two blockers, for political communication in general. And that's something that we saw in our qualitative research that completely backed up everything that we've seen. And it also suggests ways that we can, A, interpret the data that we then look at in terms of people engaging with politicians on Facebook, and B, gives us ideas about how we might move forward in trying to improve the communications. And so, all that I really wanted to say there, I don't think that many of you are likely to use qualitative research or directly do it yourselves, but I recommend at least, you know, talking to some people that do it and thinking about including that, particularly when you have, when you see things in your data that you have a hard time explaining. It's worth thinking about the idea of going and asking people. Yeah.
So I think I'm one of those people who's also been trained to be distrustful of qualitative data. So I'm wondering how you got over like the prejudice where like the prejudice is based on the idea that what people are telling you isn't nearly as important as the, you know, the revealed thing that they're doing, and how you sort of reconcile, you know, the fact that, you know, talk is cheap.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a psychologist, and so I'm fully aware that most people's explanations for their behavior are not actually the thing that's driving their behavior, right? But the way that I kind of overcame that was the realization that there's certain kinds of insights that you can get that you can't get otherwise, right? And so, yeah, I mean, for instance, you know, you ask people, did you vote in the last election? And you'll get like 95% like, oh yeah, absolutely, I voted in the last election, right? And so, you know, you just learn that certain kinds of questions are not going to get you kind of any kind of ground truth, but other ones in terms of like, for instance, like, why are you following this politician? Like, you know, yeah.
Gotcha. That's helpful.
Okay. So yeah, just my point here was just like, consider it. Don't devalue it like I once did, you know, because there are certain ways in certain areas where it's extremely valuable. I certainly wouldn't, like I said, it's not generalizable. I would never take the results that I got from it and say, okay, this is the answer. Instead, what I say is like, oh, this is the way that we should look at the data. This is the way that we should construct our survey, right? Because it informs the next stage of research, right? Or it helps you interpret the kind of data collection and data analysis you've already done. Okay, surveys and data mining. This is something that I know you guys talked about. There were some excellent slides that I saw about how you like combine the surveys and predict. Well, I'm going to talk about another instance of that. So how many people here are familiar with the game Halo? All right, a reasonable number. So this is a first-person shooter on Xbox. The way that it works is there's a bunch of different kinds of games. The games that, like within Halo, the kind of game that we focused on is a 4x4 competition. So basically you jump into this world, you're paired up with 3 other people, and you're playing against a team of 4 other people that also got paired up, and you're just trying to kill each other as many times as possible. It's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. This was, I don't know, 2007 or 8 or something. Bungie released, the makers of this game said, hey, we're going to open up an API that will allow you to access data on the gameplay. And I have been interested for a while in kind of team dynamics and the effects of team dynamics on group success. And I thought, oh, wow, what an awesome, like, quasi-real world, you know, as much as aliens are real, real world instance of actual team performance. But the data that was available was very not particularly rich, right? It was very rich in terms of like you knew exactly when and where everybody died and who killed whom, right? But in terms of who these people actually were that were playing, there was just not a lot of data. And so what we did with Aaron Closet is we went to the Halo communities, right? So there are like forums and discussion boards where people would like talk about playing Halo, and we invited them to complete a survey. In this survey, we asked, simple demographics, gender, age. I think there was another one. We asked some psychometrics about teams. So when you think about the team that you usually play with, how much cohesion do you feel? How much conflict is in there? What kind of leader style do you feel like you have in your team? What are the different roles in your team? Which of these people are your friends? Either online or offline, you could choose both. And then some questions about what you think about gameplay on Halo. And so we had about a little less than 1,200 people complete the survey. Almost 100% of people reported their gender, and of them, 94.9% were men. Completely unsurprising. And while, as I will show shortly, our survey population was biased, I don't think that the bias, I expect that gender bias reflects the reality on Halo. The average age was 22, the median age was 20. And so we had this survey data, and we also collected the game for a random sample of nearly 1 million people through the API. And so the first thing to note, as I just alluded to, is that the survey respondents were different than the random sample that we looked at. So on the x-axis on the left plot is the playtime on a log scale. Okay, so basically the survey respondents played an order of magnitude more than the typical player. And then when you look at on the right hand, that's the proportion of the games that they played, what proportion did they win? And you see that the survey respondents were just way better than the typical player, right? Now, it's also worth noting that for the typical player, it has to be centered around 50% because these were competitive games. And so, the typical player is going to win as equally likely as lose. But it just shows that our players, our survey respondents were very clearly far more active and much better players than the typical person. And so when we were doing predictions, we had to do kind of adjustment downward, some kind of propensity score matching to try to readjust the survey population for the actual typical player. One of the things that we wanted to do with the survey data, so as I mentioned, they could select which of these other gamer IDs are your friends, either online or offline. And so then what we wanted to do is say, okay, we have for these 1,200 people, we have their friendships. How well can we predict that 2 other people not in our survey data are friends? And it turned out actually to be pretty easy. So one of the best signals was the number of mutual games, which makes sense, right? So if you play games with this person a lot, more than a random other person, you're likely to be friends. And so all of the friend distributions were significantly greater than the random stranger. Another key signal was actually synchrony of games. So if you play on Tuesday afternoons every week and this other person plays on Tuesday afternoons every week, you're highly likely to be friends, right? And that's because friends tend to coordinate when they're going to play together because they like to play together. And in the end, we had a really great ROC curve here in terms of our predictive accuracy for friendships, which we could use to predict friendships across the whole graph. And one of the things that we then did with that is try to predict the impact of friendships on gameplay. And so Friends for the Win, it's the title of the paper. Basically what we see, this is the proportion of wins on the y-axis and the number of friends that are on your 4-person team, right, other than you. And just the more friends that you have on the team, the more likely you are to win. And we looked at other kinds of things. We controlled for experience and a bunch of other variables that we had that might also predict success, and still friendship was a significant predictor of success. And so this suggests that there's actually some coordinative benefit that comes from experience playing with these people and potentially comes from friendships. So that was just one example of a way in which we combined data mining with survey data using this methodology that was discussed last week. Any questions before I move on to the next one? Okay. Crowdsourcing experiments. I debated whether to include this one, but I will. So this was the very first mechanical Turk experiment I ever did. one of the first, possibly ever. I'm old, shut up. And so there were two tasks, there were sort of two experiments. We did this as two studies. In the first study, we wanted a task where if you put in more effort, you would have greater accuracy. That was one criteria. It needed to be something where plausibly a computer could not do it, which is why we were asking the Turkers to do this instead of having a computer do it. And then we wanted it so that we could vary the difficulty, and so that we could manually vary the difficulty. And so what we have here are traffic photos. So there's a bunch of traffic cams that you can just access online, and I just scraped them periodically. And we said we lost the timestamps on these photos. We need them arranged in the correct order. And so what you can do, like in this one, there's a bus here, and then it's a little bit farther away, and then it's a little bit farther away, right? And so those are the kinds of cues that the workers could use to put them into the right order. It also means that, you know, if you have to kind of pay attention, you kind of have to focus to do it right. And then we varied the difficulty by saying, here's 2 photos, 3 photos, or 4 photos that you have to put into the correct order. This one was good, but it had a couple of issues with it. There was this thing where they knew when they were done, they knew that they were complete. There was no sense of I'm going to skip it. It was sort of like if I'm a hard worker and I'm going to put effort into it, I'm putting effort into it. There's no sort of variability. And so we then moved to this word search where we said, here's 20 words, and some subset of these 20 words are actually in this puzzle. Find as many as you can. And then we could actually alter the payment scheme so that it was either per word, right? So for every word that you find, we're going to pay you some amount of money, or it was per puzzle. So every puzzle that you finish, we're going to pay you some amount of money. And this way, they actually had the choice to say, okay, I think that I found all of the words that are in here, because the number of words that were of this set that were available varied from puzzle to puzzle, so they never knew exactly when they were done. Unless they spent a lot of time, but the more time they spent, the less money they were making per hour. Right? And so what we found, quick note on the mechanical turking. So this was also a really good usage of mechanical turk, or a really good study to do on mechanical turk, because it was about the impact of incentives on a platform that was all about payment as incentives, right? So it was very much like natural to the mechanical turk platform, which is part of the reason why we ended up doing it. And so what we found on the left, this is from the photo ordering. And you see there's these, the difficulty goes up, so as it gets easier, the accuracy is higher. But also, as we paid them more, the accuracy went up, right? I'm sorry, not accuracy, the number of tasks completed. So if it was easier, they did more tasks, blah. Over here, this picture is not very clear at all. This is the number of puzzles completed. And this is when we didn't pay them at all. So there was a condition here where we didn't pay them at all, and we paid them a flat rate and then didn't pay them per puzzle. It was just like, here's 50 cents and do as many as you want. They completed about 5. If we paid them per puzzle or per word, they did much higher. They did about twice as many. And then this is the payment amount, which you can't again really see. When we paid per puzzle, there wasn't really a lot of change in terms of the number of words that they found. When we paid them per word, there was an increase. Okay, so quantity goes up by incentive, but when we looked at accuracy, it was really flat, right? So basically, at least for these tasks, there was no difference in terms of the accuracy. We didn't see an impact of the payment on their actual performance. Now, there's been a lot of research on mechanical turkers using incentives to look at different things. And I think that there's almost certainly some situations in which pay is going to get you to actually have higher accuracy, right? But at the very least, what this shows is that there's some cases where it's not. right? And that's worth something. Yeah.
I have a quick but specific question.
Yep.
So I've looked at this data because it's on Open Science Framework, so thank you for that. Is there data, because like one of the missing things on this graph is like how long it took them to do the tasks. I just wanted to know if you saw effects.
Like how much time they spent on it.
Yeah, like because in some of these studies they measure like, oh, people are like more careful if you pay more. They'll take longer time on it.
Yes. Okay. I'm dredging up some very old memories, but the what I remember is that the time spent data was actually really noisy. Like even like we have some relatively high error bars, relatively large error bars here. Like the error bars around the time spent was really noisy, and so there was just no signal there at all.
You're talking about on like you use the Turk where it says time started and time submitted. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because that was before we knew better.
Got it.
But my favorite result from this paper, actually, although I think that, like I say, I think that this is, really says something. But my favorite result is this one, in which, after the fact, we asked them, how much do you think that you should be paid? All right, and so in the word per puzzle, this is when they were paid 1 cent. I'm sorry, for the picture sorting one. This is when they were paid 1 cent per image set. And they thought that they should be paid 7 cents. And then the people that were paid 10 cents thought that they should be paid 15 cents. Right? So there's this nice linear relationship between how much they were paid and how much they thought they should be paid. And you see basically the same linear relationship here. This is when they were paid 1 cent per puzzle and 10 cents per puzzle. And it's basically, this is 7 cents per puzzle, or, I don't know, 15, 12 cents per puzzle. And down here, this is per word. They were paid 1 cent per word. They thought they should be paid 2 cents per word, or 3 cents per word. They thought they should be paid like 4 cents per word, or something like that. But the part that's most interesting to me is the people that didn't get paid at all. How much do they think, right? And particularly in the per puzzle, they thought they should be paid 10 cents per puzzle, which is more than the people that were paid the least amount, right? So basically, we were anchoring them to expect a lower pay, right? So if you want to pay them less, if you want to pay your workers less, pay them very little, and then move it up to like below what they would have asked for if you had never paid them at all. That's not actually my advice. That's totally unethical. I just want to be clear here. You should pay them what they're actually worth. There's actually a lot of good work now on the kind of wage rates that are happening on Mechanical Turk, and the kind of the way that workers are being treated on Mechanical Turk that I think is just fantastic, and I highly recommend you look into it. Okay. Networked experiments. So this is kind of the biggest piece of my talk, and it's also some of my some of the work that I like the most. And so in this one, we start with a game, and this was called Wildcat Wells, and basically, again, this was Turkers playing this game, and the objective with the way that it worked was. This is you have 15 rounds and 3 other players that you're playing with. On each round, you pick a spot on the landscape, and you get some value for that, right? And it's colored here to indicate how much value you got. So let's say this is my first one, so I got that many points. Player A drilled here, picked that spot and got that many points, right? And so what you see, what the behavior is that oh, this is where the action is. Let's go to where the action is, right? And they were paid by the number of points they got at the end. It was the case where if you picked the exact same red spot as player A in the next round, you'd get exactly the same number of points as player A had gotten. Okay. Now, there were 2 parts. So this is the game. They played this for 15 rounds. They didn't know who player A, B, or C was. And and they just got as many points as they could. Now, there are two pieces of information that was not available to them. And the first is the underlying payoff function, right? So this is a sort of three-dimensional figure of the scoring function, one of the scoring functions that was used that they were exploring, right? And this is a cross-sectional slice of it. So you see there's this one clear spot, you know, which is equivalent to like striking oil when you're doing wildcatting, right? And but it's a very rugged landscape, so there's some local maxima where people can start to climb up and think that they found something, and then they haven't. So that was the first piece of information that was missing to them. The second piece of information that was missing to them was the fact that they were actually embedded in a communication network, right? So this is the actual network that they were embedded in. Now these are all fixed degree networks, which is to say everybody had to have 3 neighbors because of the way that the game was structured, right? So you were playing with 3 other people. But these are all very different in terms of their topological characteristics. And in particular, I want to highlight the fact that on the top row, you have very structured and long path length networks. So it takes a long while, you know, there's a lot of different hops between that player and that player, or between that player and that player. Whereas on the bottom, these are all fairly unstructured networks. They're fairly flat networks with relatively low path degree, but path length between any 2 nodes. And so all that anybody ever saw was that they were playing with 3 other people. They didn't know what kind of network they were in, and they didn't know where in the network they were at. So how did we actually accomplish this on Mechanical Turk? I'm going to take a quick 3-slide digression into the actual methodology of doing this. So one of the first things that we discovered was that getting that many people to show up at the same, that many Turkers to show up at the same time, because you need them all there playing together at the same time, was non-trivial. And so what we had to do was the first thing that we did is we built a panel of people that we could email and say, hey, come, we're going to launch this game or this, this hit on Mechanical Turk at the same time. Please come and play at that time. And so we did a pilot study, and in that pilot study, we gave them, it was basically training for how to play the game. And then it was also recruiting them in so that we could email them to say, hey, come back and play this game again. We also had to make it so that whenever 8 players got in, or 16 players got in, because this was 16-player networks, that would get shipped off, and then the next 16 people would come in and then go into the next one. So it had to be this rotating thing. When we asked people if they wanted to be notified of future studies, we had between like an 80 and 85% opt-in rate. So it was actually really good. I think perhaps because these were games, and people like playing games. So then we had this waiting room, right, where they come in, they're sitting in the waiting room, and they're saying, oh, you're waiting for this many more players to show up before the game will start. And you see instances where the number would go up and then it would start going down, because it would never quite reach the threshold, and they'd all have to, and then you'd lose that one. But often you'd get more than enough, and you'd actually have several instances running at the same time. Another thing that's important for any online study, any kind of thing where you're doing an online experiment, is attrition. So I have been doing lab experiments, and lab experiments, you almost never see somebody actually just get up in the middle of the study and leave, whereas that happens all the time online. And so you have to be prepared for that, and you have to be prepared for it in 2 ways, right? So one is you have to have a timeout and a default action. You have to have, you can't let everything fall apart. Like if your experiment is dead, if your study is dead because one person left, you're going to waste lots and lots and lots of data. And so you need to find some way where some action and some timeout where you can say, okay, this person's gone and some action is going to happen in their stead. And then importantly, you need to have a statistical method to analyze it when that happens, other than just tossing out the data, because as I said, you're just wasting a lot of data. And so if you're ever going to do an online multiplayer experiment, make sure that you've got the analysis at the end in your mind, because you need to make sure that that you can do that. So, just going through the results really quickly. How am I doing on time? Great. Basically, this is over the rounds, over the 15 rounds, the average points earned. And what we saw is, it's not perfect separation, but it's definitely true that the ones that had low structure tended to get to the maximum earlier, tended to get more points earlier than the ones with the high structure and the longer path lengths. And so, you can see why this is in this instance. So what we have here is this is a side-by-side going through rounds 1 through 15 with two different networks. The nodes are colored based on how many points they earned in that round, right? So this person got about 30 points, this person got about 40 points, okay? And this is round 1. 2, 3, okay. So at this point, round 3, you can see that this person's getting, that these people have found this person found some good points and his neighbors have copied that solution or are exploring in an area nearby. This person found something good and this person then copied, right? 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So by round 7, this is the best, they found the absolute best possible score on the landscape, and every single person has now got that best score. Whereas over here, this poor person over here still hasn't even learned that there's where the good space is, right? And so what we see is that because of these longer path lengths and the nature of the problem, the network structures that take a longer time for the good solution to pass are going to perform worse. Another interesting thing that we saw is that what we have here in this plot, you see the best, median, and worst performing player in a particular kind of graph, right? And so the kind of unstructured graphs are at the top, and the more structured graphs are at the bottom. And what you see is that the worst performing player in this unstructured graph is doing better than the best performing player in this one. So it's not just that individual performing. When you're averaged over a lot of different graphs, the network structure isn't just hurting sort of the group, it's hurting the individuals too. But if you care about relative performance, right, if what you care about is relative performance, the difference between the best and the worst position here is much greater than the difference there. And you can see that.
I have a question.
Okay, let me almost. So you can see that in this figure, right? So this is sort of what I call the quasi-hierarchy, right? Where you've got the central node and then the two VPs and the peons, right? And the president, the person in the center has a shorter path length to everybody else, so they find the best solution faster on average, right? But this person in the center still is not doing as well as the average person in this one, in this decentralized graph.
So in the previous slide where you ordered the networks from more random to more structured, or is that roughly going along with average path length as we go down as the average path length?
So these four have almost identical average path lengths, but yes, it is roughly in average path length. So another thing that was kind of interesting in this is that it turns out that there was this exploration-exploitation trade-off, right? So unsurprisingly, if your neighbor finds the peak, and so we said if you're guessing within some radius of the best solution, you've found the peak, okay? So unsurprisingly, the probability of you copying your neighbor if they found the peak is almost 100% every time. It's no duh, right? They've got a lot of points, I'm going to do what they're doing. The probability of copying your neighbor when they haven't found the peak, right, which is this other line, still goes up as the rounds increase, right? And the reason that is because if your neighbor has more points than you, and the amount of time left to explore is diminishing, eventually you're going to make this decision I would rather just try to get the most points that I can from the best solution that's been found so far, rather than continuing to explore and hoping to get that really awesome best solution, right? So people were copying each other at the end, even when there was no, like, when the best solution hadn't been found. But what this means is that everybody's making this decision about when they're going to switch from exploring to try to find the best solution to just exploiting the best solution that's already been found. Everybody is making that decision on their own at their own time. And so what this leads to is a kind of social dilemma. So if you look, right, so this is the proportion of rounds. So out of the 15 rounds, what fraction of them did you copy a neighbor? Okay, did this one individual copy a neighbor? And some of our players came back and played multiple games, right? Some of the individuals came back and played multiple games. So this is averaged across all of the games that they played, all of the rounds that they played across all of the games that they played. How often did they copy one of their neighbors, right? And you see, and this is the average points across all of those rounds, and what you see is that the more that they copy, on average, the better they do, the more points they get, right? So actually copying is a solution, right? But this next plot is completely unsurprising, which is the proportion of players within a given game instance that are copying. The probability of finding the peak or getting the good score goes down, right? As fewer people are exploring, the less likely you are to actually find a good solution. And so you have this social dilemma where the people, like the kind of selfish choice is to just exploit your neighbors and copy them in free ride, whereas the like collective good is for everybody to explore as long as possible, right? And what we found, one of the things that we found that was really interesting is that this is the proportion of copying before the peak is found. So how many rounds on average did we see people copying other people's behavior before the peak is found, or when the peak is never found, right? And what you see is that this is the same ordering as before in terms of the structure and the path length. And what you see is that in general, these structured networks tend to have more copying than the unstructured networks. And in fact, this is statistically significant. Now this is odd, right? Because the people didn't know what network they were in, and they didn't know where in the network they were in. And yet you still see more copying in these structured networks. So how is that possible? And what we found is that the answer to this is basically this left slide. The more neighbors you have that are connected to each other, i.e. the density of your network, the higher the density of the network, the higher probability that you are copying one of them, right? And then in the second one, so this is the higher probability that you have neighbors that are searching in an area similar to you, and then the more neighbors that you have that are searching in the same space, the more likely it is that you're going to copy them. So in other words, there's this kind of social proof about the decision for when to switch from exploration to exploitation. So if you see your neighbors, if your neighbors are all starting to like coalesce around the same point, you're going to think, oh, I should start coalescing around that same point too. We've given up on exploring for the best solution, and the group has come and decided that we're going to stop exploring, right? But if you're in a position where your neighbors are not connected to each other, they're not seeing each other's behavior, and so they're never going to be, or almost only by chance are they going to be exploring the same space, right? So this is how it affects. It's basically this social proof of the decision to stop exploration that happens, that is more likely to happen in the clustered networks. And so this just, subtly influences the decision to explore or exploit. Yeah.
Can I ask like a broad question, which I don't know if there's a right answer to this, which is that whenever I've thought about sort of neighbors and networks, I always imagine like neighbors, right? Like people who actually live next door to you, right? But it seems that in many of the sort of social network studies, the neighbors are operationalized in these video game settings, right? And I'm wondering and I understand that we should use what's available, and these video games are available and they're really effective at testing. But I'm wondering if you can speak to the difference, if you think there is any, between what we're observing in these sort of video game, highly stylized environments and the real world, right? The world outside of these sort of insular. And maybe there's no answer to it, maybe it's just the best way. But I'm wondering what the trade-offs are and what how generalizable you think these are.
So there's two things going on here. So first is I'm absolutely using jargon here when I say neighbors because I'm talking about network neighbors.
Yeah.
In the real world context, this would be friends because these are people or whatever people that are connected by a tie. So there's just that jargon thing going on. One. Right. The second thing is that I had the same problem with this read. I love this research. I think that it's got some really awesome findings in it, but I was concerned about the external validity. I mean, no doubt. And in fact, the last study that I'm going to talk about was actually motivated by that exact concern. We wanted to take this kind of research and move it into what is effectively a more realistic setting. And so I'll get to that in a bit.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah. Right after I talk about this next one. So simulations. So this is I wanted to have a note of caution here. So we used, after this study, we had done this study, we had collected all this data on the way that people behaved in these networks. But there's a lot of questions, like for instance, we kind of had to use fixed degree networks because of the nature of the user interface and the way that, we could make it work. We had limitations in the size of the networks that we could use because even getting 16 people to show up at one time to do an experiment was pretty hard. And so there's a lot of things that you can do through simulation modeling, agent-based modeling, but the question is, what do you actually learn from agent-based models? And so, in fact, as I was making the transition from grad school to Yahoo, the project that I was working on was this simulation study of coordination behaviors. So that was actually trying to model fashion cycles. But it ended up going nowhere because in the end there was no data, right? It was just a simulation and there was like our toy model and, what was it doing? It wasn't doing anything. And so I had a lot of excitement about agent-based models, and then I had a lot of skepticism, and I've come to this nice middle ground which I want to share with you. Which is that I think agent-based models are useful, or computational models generally are useful to prove that something is either possible or impossible. So if the current theory says that something is impossible, and you do an agent-based model that shows that in fact under these conditions it is possible, you've actually demonstrated something that contradicts the current theory and is likely to lead to some excellent research, therefore, and therefore on its own stands as a contribution to science, right? You can also use agent-based models to generate hypotheses, which is basically what we're doing in this case, right? So we wanted to understand what might happen with humans if we take this at a broader scale and that sort of thing, in different kinds of networks. And so we could do this sort of cheap, fast simulations on different kinds of networks that then once we've generated our hypotheses, we can go back to the actual experimental setting and test those hypotheses. And then a third case for where I feel like they're actually useful is when you're testing the internal consistency of a theoretical model. So a theoretical model says, makes some predictions, but it's only been tested in the real world under some conditions. If you can replicate that theoretical model in some simulation study and then test conditions that are maybe harder or more expensive to test, you can actually, again, test the boundaries, which is a little bit like generating hypotheses, but I think that sometimes you can actually find cases where it invalidates a theoretical model, which leads to new theorizing, which is even more exciting. In this case, what we did is we made agents based on our real experimental participants. So we basically extracted the individual playing strategies with respect to when they were likely to stop exploring. We built an agent-based simulation where the agents play like real players, based on these kind of individual playing strategies. And then we can explore different problem spaces to make new hypotheses, as I was just saying. So these are the probability of exactly copying or imitating, i.e. searching the local area around a neighbor's space, given that the peak has not yet been found. And what you see is that, some people never, even at the end, they're not really very likely to copy or imitate. They're still doing a lot of exploration even at the end, whereas you have other people that very quickly get to the point where they're just exploiting and doing what they can. And so what we did is we modeled this for every single player that we had in our data, and then used that as a pool of strategies that the agents drew from. So we created a population of agents by drawing from this pool of different strategies. And so we fit this linear model, we got the slopes and intercepts, and that became the parameters for the agents. We also had this additional thing where if one of your neighbors has a score of 100, you do that, right? If your neighbors have a score between 60 and 100, where 60 is roughly the maximum non-peak score that you could get. So if it's between 60 and 100, then you you explore around that. Otherwise, you just copy the highest score with probability based on this parameters that we gave to the agent. And it was lovely. So this is the average points earned over the 15 rounds for the agents and for the humans, right? This is
This is super cool. Because I really like this idea of doing this, and I'm curious how hard it was to build an agent-based model that calibrates so well to the experiments.
This calibration was virtue of, so initially we thought we were just going to use this piece, right, which is just use the parameters from the users. But what we noticed was that when we did that, we had this huge degeneracy whenever one of the agents stumbled into a peak. They just behaved like wild, like crazy. And so actually what we did is we went back to the human data and discovered that they were effectively using these kinds of rules too. I don't know that this is exactly what they were doing, but that was a close replication. But after we had made that basic adjustment to it, everything else just fell out.
So it wasn't like it took months and months and months of work to get it to line up.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So earlier you extolled the values of qualitative survey research. This seems like a pretty simple strategy that someone could self-report.
Yeah. And I wish I had done that. The one thing that I do have was we were very active on the Mechanical Turk forums while this game was going. We had a lot of interaction and engagement with our participants. They were great. They were really wonderful. For instance, we asked them at the beginning to please not, you can talk about the game that you're playing, but please don't say things like, I'm guessing in this area of the map, or, we gave them guidelines about what not to talk about. Nobody violated the guidelines. And when somebody came close to violating the guidelines, they'd self-police. It was amazing. And so in that, you saw the kinds of things that I'm talking about in qualitative research, where somebody was where they talk about they actually had it, the liberal and conservative strategies is what they called it, which was basically the exploration versus exploitation. it mapped onto it perfectly. They had they definitely said things like, I think I found it, talking about the peak. So they kind of had this thing. There was, to kind of support some of my theoretical underpinnings of this, they also said things like, I'm not sure that this one has one, I don't know if the peak exists in this one. I think it doesn't exist, or, I'm going to give up and I'm going to just start but no, I think that you're absolutely right. This would be a great instance in which I could have asked them and said, hey, why were you doing this or that? I had a little bit of window because of the forums, but yeah, absolutely. So that's not where it ends, right? So this is the average number of rounds to converge on the peak for the different network structures. This is the agent-based model. These are the humans. This is the rounds to converge the points, the plot that I showed you at the beginning. And all right, this is the agents, and these are the humans, right? So it just really mapped nice and cleanly. These are the same, yeah. We then, applied this to the bigger graphs. Unfortunately, there was there were still some problems when we went to generalize it to different problem spaces. Some of these strategies, like the strategies that kind of got baked into this rule set, started to break down when we gave them, for instance, different problem spaces, because this is clearly based on that. And in fact, what we decided we wanted to do was try different variations on the experiment so that we could sort of make more realistic agent models before we really moved into other spaces. And here's the sad part, that never really happened. So if anybody wants to pick that up, you're more than welcome to. Okay, so last one, and this gets to the question of the more realistic setting. One of my struggles with this experiment, and one of the reasons why we didn't continue in this direction, was because in the end I started to feel like, well, what is this little game really telling us about human behavior? And I think that there's a lot in terms of the fundamental aspects of exploration and exploitation. I think that came through very clearly. The decisions about the fact that there's this social proof mechanism that factors into the decision about exploration and exploitation. I think that's all completely solid and legitimate. But again, it just left this question of yeah, but I want something that's kind of more real. And honestly, one of the reasons why I went this direction, I mean, obviously it has the advantage of being a really nice, tightly controlled experiment, and that's one of the things that you want. You want to have a lot of experimental control. But, trying to think of a real-world example that would give us the ability to study these kinds of phenomenon with this level of experimental control and still have external validity, it just took a long time to come up with something. But eventually it came around, and that was crisis mapping. And so we decided to use crisis mapping as a model problem. Now there's this group, the Standby Task Force, and basically for almost a decade now, they've been basically creating maps around a crisis, talking about where are things bad, where are bridges down, where does food need to go, creating these maps so that first responders can actually have some information. And the way that they create these maps is by trolling social media and news sites and blogs and that sort of thing. And so they go through all of this and they figure out what is a real report or what is likely to be a real report. They validate it, they geolocate it, they put it on a map. And the way that they've been doing this for the past almost 10 years is with this huge, ridiculous, complex set of tools. So they have Ushahidi, which is helpful for the map making and some crowdsourcing stuff. They're coordinating over Skype. They have Google Docs to help them manage it. They have Google Spreadsheets to help them kind of coordinate some of the things. They've got Twitter windows open. They've got different teams working on different parts. Are they doing validation? Are they doing geolocation? All of this sort of stuff. And so it seemed like a space where there was an opportunity to, possibly contribute tools and facilities to these crisis mappers. And two, it's a real-world situation in which people are using social media to do a group activity purely online, right? So it has all of these qualities that we wanted for the experimentation. And so this is in collaboration with Andrew Mao, Sid Surrey, and Duncan Watts. I guess I should have been talking about my co-authors more before. It was mostly Sid Surrey and Duncan Watts. And so Andrew basically built this tool. And so what it is you have a Twitter stream on the left. You can take a tweet and put it into an event record in the central location. You have a chat window over here for people to coordinate. And then you have a map where you can take the event records and geolocate them on the map. And this is all real-time collaborative tool that everybody can use. And so this is not just the tool that we're trying to build for the crisis mappers, it's also the experimental platform, because the series of tweets on the left is the only information that they're using in order to create these event records, right? And to then eventually put them on a map. So what we can do is we can use the same tweet stream over and over again and manipulate different characteristics of the group in order to understand the impact of these group characteristics on the performance of the group. And in fact, in the end, so this is the track of a typhoon, Pablo, and these are the events that were mapped by the standby task force. It had about like 18 to 32 volunteers over 12 hours to generate that. And then in 1 hour with 16 Turkers that had never seen this crisis before, basically were able to replicate the map. And so that's awesome. But it also, we also had this really great degree of experimental control. So we can manipulate how many people are working on it at the same time. We can direct which Turkers are going to which instance of the experiment. We have this like very this is a timeline of people coming in and taking actions on it. We can affect what actions they're able to take, what pieces of the information they're able to see, what kinds of roles we assign them into. And it's also a highly instrumented environment. That is to say, we have measurements of every single action that's being taken. When is somebody looking at this tweet? When are they dragging it over and turning it into an event? When are they chatting in the chat box? When, all of this. So we have really like high experimental control, high, really good data, and a really nice external validity. And so this was our kind of great key platform. Now, the question that we started with was very simple. We wanted to start easy, which was just what is the impact of group size on performance? But in order to understand the impact of group size on performance, we need to be able to quantify performance. So how did we do that? Well, the thing is that in actuality, even the standby task force map is not the perfect map. There were some tweets that had relevant event information that they didn't capture, for instance. And then there were, other event reports. There were some duplications, some things where it was questionable, where it's like, there was one report of people stranded in this area, and another report of people stranded in this area, and then a third report of just, let's say there's 5 over here and 5 over here, and then another report of 10 in this general area. Well, how many different events is that, right? So it actually was kind of tricky to determine what is going to be our ground truth. And so we basically took a lot of our hand labeling and some pilot experiments with the Turkers and the standby task force and collated that all into this group, into this gold standard. And so then we could measure the group performance with respect to this gold standard in terms of precision, recall, and F1 score for each of the groups. And again, because we care about both false negatives and false positives with respect to first responders, we looked at the F1 score. So we quantified this in terms of person hours because the way that it was supposed to work is that we had groups of different size, so 1, 2, 4, 8, and 16 person groups. But sometimes people came in a little late, so they didn't actually all start at the same time. Sometimes there was actually only 13 people playing instead of 16 people. And so to normalize that, we calculated it as person hours. And so this is just a proxy for group size. Okay. And what we see is that the more people, and they all did it for 1 hour, regardless of how many people. It was like 1 hour, and that was the thing. But what we see is that in terms of the F1 score, their precision and recall, you see that as the group size goes up, the performance actually goes up. And this is breaking it down into precision and recall. And what you see is that in terms of the events that were actually captured, the accuracy was, the precision was relatively flat. There wasn't actually a lot of difference in terms of group size. So all of the impact of group size on performance is actually coming through recall, as you would expect. So the more people that are on the team, the more events they're able to capture in the amount of time that they're working. Yeah.
Did you have an expectation about the relationship between group size and performance going in?
I mean, there's kind of our initial hypothesis was something like a inverse U. Okay. So the idea being that we thought that there might be some point at which the coordination costs started to outweigh the benefits of the greater group size. And so would see, at the highest level, you'd start to see it kind of decline. And in fact, you do maybe see some leveling off, but that might be a little reading the tea leaves.
But now, do you think if you could get like a 60-person group or 100-person group, do you think the U is still there and it's just a scale thing, or you now think the U might not be there?
I think that I actually do think that you'd start to see some drop off, yeah, in terms of relative performance. Well, okay, yeah. I think that I actually think no, on the F1 score just purely, I actually think it would just level off. Because I think there's going to be some maximum accuracy, and once you have enough people working on it, when you're normalizing it by the number of people, which, no, I don't have that. Oh yes, well, we'll get there. Okay. Right. So to your point, as the group size goes up, this is the normalized effort, and I'm not going to get into how we calculated it, but just think of it as we calculated how much effort they were putting into this. It's okay. Fine, I will get into it. We weighted how much time each action took. Were you just deleting a tweet, or were you actually writing out a full event record, right? And those things take different amounts of time. We saw how many of those events they did, and then figured out we said that was the effort that they spent. And we see as the group size goes up, the average effort per person goes down. These are the different kinds of actions. So filtering is relatively low cost, classifying is relatively high cost, and you see that filtering, the probability of filtering goes up as the group size gets bigger, but the probability of classifying goes down. So you see these kind of diminishing effects of group size, but then you also see, as group size goes up, the probability that you're actually working with another person on the same event record also goes up, unsurprisingly. And so there's this question of how do you compare the group sizes? So on the one hand, it's just, okay, independent workers are more productive per capita. Okay, so they exert more effort. They allocate the effort to allocate more of their effort to exert in the harder subtasks, so they work on the harder tasks when they're working independently. But when you're in a team, you collaborate more, and so there's the potential that you're actually correcting errors and you're increasing efficiency through those processes. And so in order to try to figure out what is the right standard, what we did is we actually created simulations. So we created synthetic groups by combining the output of n individuals and saying, okay, here's a group of non-coordinating individuals, right? So we take the performance of the individuals and throw them together randomly and say, this is the performance of this synthetic group, of this group size. And then any difference between the performance of that synthetic group and the performance of the actual group is going to be based on the coordinative benefit of being in a group. And so, what you see here, the blue bars are the synthetic groups, and then the points are, again, the actual data. And what you see is that in the synthetic groups, you actually see this diminishing returns, right, in terms of the precision and recall, but that's because there's no coordination. They're not determining, basically the benefits that we're going to see here is that people are saying, I'm working on this event, so you work on some other event, right? And that is the whole benefit of coordination within a group. And so, as the group size goes up, that, in the synthetic groups, that goes away, but in the, real people, they are actually coordinating and you're actually seeing the benefit of coordination. I'm going to skip the next bit. Specialization. So this is a really fun visualization about how people chose to work on different things. The purple people, these were people that like to chat a lot. Leaders. The red is the people that like to filter, so they just kind of deleted tweets that were irrelevant. And the green were people that like to, that were actually doing the harder classification work. And so we actually did see some specialization, not a whole lot, but we saw some specialization as the group size went up. But it turns out that that specialization really didn't impact the productivity of the group very much. It's possible that, so we did absolutely nothing to encourage specialization. This is just the kinds of specialization that happened automatically. And we kind of think that because, again, they only had an hour to complete this task, we kind of think that there just wasn't enough time to establish the roles that are necessary for that kind of specialization. And we suspect that if we had repeated games, we would have ended up with more specialization and then potentially benefits of specialization.
Did you guys think about assigning people to?
Yes, we did. We haven't done it. Yeah.
So the synthetic controls, were you only pulling from n equals 1 to create, because you could also combine 4 groups of n equals 4 compared to 16.
Yeah,
you
no,
say
we
something
were
about like optimal chunking.
Yeah, we were pulling from. I'm pretty sure we were pulling from all of them. Yes, we reached a limit. We reached a limit in terms of the number. No, we were just pulling from the n equals 1. We were just pulling from the n equals 1. Yeah, yeah. And because if we were pulling from the people within the groups, we were afraid that that would contaminate because their performance would have benefited from the coordination of being in that group. So we were taking the performance of the individuals and combining them together, right?
But that's exactly my point. Like if I'm a manager with 16 employees, should I have them work individually, groups of 4, or one big group of 16, right? Like.
So what we're seeing here is that, so yeah, these synthetic groups are made from completely independent people, right? And basically working independently sort of peaks out in terms of like around 8 for this task. Who knows what it is for other ones, right? But for this one, it was like 8. But there was some benefit of coordination of actually having people in the same room when the group size was larger than that. Does that answer your question? I mean, I don't think, like, the point was is we couldn't draw from, for our synthetic groups, we couldn't draw from the 4-person groups or the 2-person groups or anything like that because those individuals in those groups already benefited from the coordination within those groups.
That's the point, though, right?
Well, we're comparing to them. So we had to have our comparison be different than them. Okay, we can talk offline, yeah.
Yeah, I just had a question. In terms of, you mentioned at the beginning of this that this one had like good external validity. And just drawing back to Ethan's point, one of the questions I always have in these contexts is like questions of user interface design or time limits, like you have 1 hour and all these things. Obviously that, you know, is a big beast of a question. But in terms of us as a field, as computational, you know, social science, do you have any opinion on like the lack of attendance to those sort of things that we give in our write-ups of our reports in terms of like the scope conditions of the fact that, I mean, you mentioned it in the very first one that like compared to your lab experiments, people who play online are just more likely to drop out in the middle of it. That alone says there's some sort of different psychological things going on in terms of their dedication to this as a social activity, or potentially some sort of like that there is a lack of like my standing up and leaving this room right now is slightly awkward because these people are actually here.
Right, absolutely. That's a huge mechanism.
Yeah, but I feel like so often when we write these things up, we neglect things like user interface design or any of these difference between digital world and online world. Like, should we be moving toward a context where in our computational social write-ups, we're talking more about the fact that we're talking largely about a digital world?
So one of the, I have 2 responses to this. The first is that, one thing that I was saying earlier in one of my conversations before this talk is that there is very little penalty to overselling your results in academia. It's like, yeah. So take that how you will. But in any of this, I mean, so I feel like I'm going to just talk about psychology because that's what I know, but you see these cycles where some methodology becomes the norm, and everybody just assumes that that's okay, because when it was very first used, the very first person to use it almost always says, oh, and it's got these problems and these problems and these problems, but it's sort of our best option now, right? And then the 20th person to use it either just assumes that everybody else knows those caveats, right? Or doesn't know them themselves at that point because everybody else has been using it without having explained that context, right? And then somebody will come along. So there's this great paper, the I forget what it's called, but it's like the weird people, the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, like participants in psychology experiments, and like, oh, hey guys, maybe this isn't the most representative population. And when it was first done, when college students first started being used as subject participants in psychology research, of course, like that was well known, and it was well, like very clear, like this is a biased population. It's a convenient sample, you know. And that kind of got lost at some point. Then there was a whole paper to be like, hey guys, don't forget, this is, you know, got a problem. And so when it comes to our research using online methods, like, I mean, you know, I did this research looking at retweeting on Twitter, right? And retweeting as a norm, like how do people, you know, do they use RT @ or do they use retweet @ or do they use, you know, MT or some other variation, right? Well, that became completely irrelevant in 2011 when Twitter introduced the retweet button, right? Like, or it didn't become irrelevant, but that research like could no longer be done because the platform had changed. And if you're doing research that spanned that boundary on retweeting, and you know weren't aware of the technological platform change, you'd be like, wow, people completely stopped retweeting in 2011, right? And so I think that you're completely right that we should be very cautious about it, and it is a good idea to mention that often in the limitations when you're talking about the limitations section of your paper. But I'll get back to my very first point, which is that the cost of not doing that is almost none. And maybe there should be a cost, but it just isn't there.
So if I just have one little follow-up in terms of the user interface, like Abdullah's project today actually made me think of this just in terms of the fact that the people who run these apps or things do so much A/B testing on the user interface, right? And actually can see significant behavioral changes by, you know, showing you like in a big window, these are what your neighbors are doing, which is like subliminally telling you maybe you should pay attention to your neighbors. Where maybe if you put it somewhere else or made the box smaller, people would pay less attention to the neighbors, even though the information is still available. Like, do you think we should engage at all with the kind of, is there a
So there's a
space for
whole research community on this.
that? But it's not really social science, right? It's mostly
No, it is. Like a lot of psychologists and sociologists and ethnographers end up in HCI. And so I highly encourage you to talk to them and collaborate with them and talk about their methods, because their research is very useful for informing our research.
as we develop our sort of studies.
That's right. Yeah. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, okay.